Thank you very much. I come from a little tiny town in West Virginia called Half Dollar, West Virginia. You probably won't be familiar with this, but basically there's a river and then the railroad tracks, and we had two streets. One was called Main Street, the other one was called, nah, that ain't Main Street. And then there was a mountain. So if you can imagine that here in Elkin, North Carolina, that's what Half Dollar looked like. And when I was 5 years old, now we had a dog named Deacon, and every night my dad would take Deacon for a walk, and when I was 5 years old, I was deemed old enough to go on that walk with Dad and Deacon. And I've been a father now for a collective 39 years. And one thing I've learned as a father, from a father's perspective, is there are things a father will teach a child that if the mother knew, would kill her. And I think I started learning this from a child's perspective when I started going on these walks with Dad and Deacon, because Deacon would stop at every tree, fire hydrant, and lamp post along the way, sniff around the base of it, lift his leg, and do his thing. I said, Dad, what's that about? He said, well, that's the way Deacon marks his territory. He leaves his scent on those things. And then if another dog comes into this neighborhood, he smells that. He knows this land belongs to Deacon. He'll leave it alone. I said, well, what if that dog wants the land? Dad said, well, then he leaves his mark. And the next time Deacon and that dog get together, they either talk about it or they fight about it to see who gets the land. Well, I was only 5 years old. Didn't make that much sense to me. But it did give me a whole new respect for what real estate agents did all day long. But you have to understand that right next door to us lived a little old lady. Her name was Mrs. Crankberry, and she was the single meanest woman I have ever met. She was the chairwoman down at the church for the committee for little old ladies who want to be angry about something. She was that lady in town who had her hair done religiously twice a year. She'd have it put up in sort of a cone and then sealed with some sort of concrete all-weather sealant so that it wouldn't move for 6 months. But to some twist of the universal irony, the great yin-yang, because she was so evil, she had the most beautiful yard I had ever seen. Her yard was a Four Seasons resort to a 5-year-old. It had a slope in the back that was perfect for sledding in the winter. Just on the other side of her yard was Skitter Creek, and right in the middle of her yard was a giant oak tree that used to just rain acorns all autumn long. But I was not allowed to step foot into that yard, even if one of those acorns were to drop out of that tree and roll into my yard. If Mrs. Crankberry saw me pick it up, she would come out her back door, lower that spike of hair, and chase me like a rabid rhinoceros. And this was back in the 1970s, when it was still perfectly legal to hurt your neighbor's children. So it was a very dangerous time for me. But I wanted that yard. I coveted that yard. One day I was sitting out in my own backyard. Now, I'm the last of 5 children. And I don't know if you're the last in a long line of children, but if you are, you know that by you're the 5th or 6th children, by that time, your parents really just don't care that much anymore. My parents were like, we tried everything with these 4 and nothing worked. Let him figure it out on his own. Can't do any worse than we did. So my mother was more like a jailhouse guard than a maternal character. She'd look out the window about every 8 minutes. Then I had 7 minutes and 55 seconds to do whatever I wanted to do. So she looked out the window. By that same time, Mrs. Crankberry came out of her house, got in her car, and drove away. And I suddenly had an idea. I got up out of my yard, and I walked into Mrs. Crankberry's yard. I went over to that big oak tree. I got down to my hands and knees, and I sniffed all the way around the base of that tree. Now, I didn't know exactly what I was sniffing for, but I knew it was part of the process. Then I just sort of stood up, dropped my pants, and made that tree mine. And it occurred to me that I had never once seen Mrs. Crankberry tinkle on that tree. So I didn't even know if it belonged to her, but on the other hand, I was only 5, but she was like 105. So if it came to it, I could take her in a fight. So every couple of days, I'd sneak over there and I'd make something else mine. And then she died. Now, I don't think it had anything to do with me going to the bathroom in her yard, but I can promise you that within 2 weeks of her death, everything 18 inches and below in that yard belonged to me. So you can see how it came as quite a surprise when I came home from the grocery store with my mother one day, and there was a moving van parked out in front of that house which I had rightfully claimed, people moving stuff in. I went in the backyard. There was a little kid about my age putting toys out where that was the last straw. I knew what I had to do. I walked over into that yard in front of God and everybody. I went straight up to that big oak tree. I dropped my pants and I started going. Well, that little kid thought that was pretty funny. He walked over, dropped his pants, and he started going. Well, I knew what I had to do. I reached over and I slugged him as hard as I could. Well, he slugged me back. And the next thing you know, you got 2 5-year-old boys with their pants around their ankles fighting to the death. Well, pretty soon our mother saw us. And you know how mothers are about stuff like that. They came over and broke us up, made us pull up our pants, apologize to each other, and introduce ourselves. I felt like I knew that kid pretty well by that point. But it turns out his name was Skeeter Bart. And after that, Skeeter and I were best friends. But having Skeeter for your best friend is sort of like having a head cold for your best friend, because you never feel right and he won't go away. And even at the tender age of 5, he was always coming up with these plans, these schemes, these ideas that even then were just barely legal. But he had such a convincing way about himself that I always had to go along with what he said. First day we ever went to school, we had not been in kindergarten for more than 10 minutes when Skeeter nudged me and he says, "Hey, don't you think we ought to make this classroom ours?" Next thing we knew, we were in the nurse's office because they hadn't invented the school psychologist by this point, and we had to stand over the toilet and prove that we knew what to do. Well, it was taking a while because we were sort of tapped out. And then Skeeter went pale. I said, "What's the matter, buddy?" He said, "I was just thinking about it. My brother had a squirt gun. He squirted somebody with it, and they took it away from him." He said, "What do you suppose they're going to do to us?" Now, we got through that unscathed. And if you jump ahead, I don't know, a couple of years, we were in probably our junior year. And we walked into health class. And our teacher, Ms. Gerdak, was standing there smoking a cigarette. Now, I went to school a long time ago. When I went to school, you could smoke in school, not the students. Students had to go out back to smoke. But the teachers could smoke right there in the classroom. And Miss Gerdak was a frugal woman. She got up in the morning, she lit her first cigarette with a Strike Anywhere match, and then she just lit every other cigarette all day long off the last one, so she never had to use another match. And then when she got done with a butt, she would stand it up on the edge of her desk, which was handy for us because there was no clock in that classroom. So we knew about 8 cigarette butts into a lecture, class was almost over. Did I mention she was our health teacher? So we walked into class, and Ms. Gerdak was holding a carton of eggs. She had a dozen eggs, and she said, as we sat down, she said, "I'm going to give each one of y'all an egg, and you got to take care of this egg for 2 weeks." And the reason she was doing this is because the local school board had decided that teachers weren't allowed to teach the students certain aspects of biology. For the same reason, they weren't going to teach us how to make gunpowder, because they thought if we knew how, we might. And so she said, "I want you all to do this experiment so you can learn what a pain in the, what a responsibility it is to be a parent." And Skeeter raised his hand and he said, "Ms. Gerdak, I don't need to carry around an egg for 2 weeks to prove that I am not responsible enough to be a parent." And Ms. Gerdak said, "Of course you're not. None of y'all are. You're just babies yourselves." She said, "That doesn't mean young people can't raise babies. Plenty have. But I just want you to think about this lesson before you go plucking apples from the tree or stealing honey from the hive." And with that, she started passing out eggs. And when a girl got an egg, it was sort of a sociology experiment. The girl would be like, "Oh, it's the most beautiful egg I've ever seen." And when a guy got an egg, he'd be like, "Ugh." And you could see he was thinking, "Scrambled." Until she got to me, and she looked at me, and she looked at the egg carton, and she said, "Lepp, I'm out of eggs." Because there were 13 people in the class, but she had only brought a dozen eggs. And this salient point illustrates why she was the health teacher and not the math teacher. And I said, that's all right, Miss Gerdak. I'm like Skeeter. I know I'm not responsible enough. She said, no, you're going to have a baby too. And she left the classroom. She went to her car. She'd stopped at the store on the way. She came back in. She dropped a 5-pound bag of flour on my desk. She said, Lepp, that's your baby. I said, how come everybody else gets an egg? I get a 5-pound bag of flour. And she said, because you're a smart aleck. I couldn't argue with that. So class ended, and I was walking to the lunchroom, and my buddy Wally, totally unprovoked, for no reason at all, just whipped a pencil at me. And right away, I learned a very valuable parenting lesson, and that is that you should not use your baby as a shield. It's effective, but it's frowned on. And the pencil went thunk right into that bag of flour, and a little bit of flour started to leak out, and I turned it on its side, and at first I was just going to push the pencil through, because you know I grew up watching Westerns, and when you get shot with an arrow, what do? You push it through, and then you pour whiskey on it and hit it with a hot brand. Well, I didn't have a hot brand, so I thought maybe I should do something else, and I was just going to pull the pencil out when I smelled smoke behind me, and Miss Gerdak said, Lepp, what are you doing? And I said, Miss Gerdak, my baby's been stabbed. She said, you got to take that baby to the doctor, get it checked out. I said, if that's the case, he's bleeding way too bad. I need to call an ambulance. So I went down to the payphone beside the office. Now, our little town of Half Dollar, there were 2 hospitals within a half hour, one to the east, one to the west, a $half. But that meant if you got sick, took the ambulance a half hour to get to you and a half hour to get back to the hospital. A lot of people died in that transition period. I don't know if you're aware of this, but West Virginia is the oldest, sickest state in the Union, giving a whole new meaning to almost heaven. So our townspeople hired an ambulance and a paramedic, guy named Handy, to live there in town with his ambulance, cut a half hour off the trip. Life expectancy went up 10 years. So I went to the payphone and I called Handy. I said, Handy, this is Bill Lepp. You got to come to the high school right now. My baby's been stabbed. And Handy said, Lepp, you don't have a baby. And I said, I do now. And he said, who's the mother? And I said, Ms. Gerdak? And he said, that's disgusting. And I said, no, it was an assignment. And he said, that doesn't make it any better. He said, oh, wait a minute, it's them eggs. When I had her for health class, we had to carry them eggs around too. But if you drop your egg, there's nothing I can do for you. That's like Humpty's Dumpty. I said, it's like what? He said, it's like Humpty's Dumpty. I said, it's not Humpty's Dumpty, it's Humpty Dumpty. He said, what are you talking about? I said, the way you said it, it's possessive, like the Dumpty belonged to the Humpty. I said, the Dumpty didn't belong to the Humpty, Humpty was the Dumpty. He said, well, what's a Dumpty? I said, I don't know. I think it's somebody's last name. He said, I don't know anybody named Dumpty. I said, I think they're English. They don't live around here. He said, well, that explains it, but if you drop your baby in England, there's nothing I can do for you. I said, I'm at the high school. He said, I'll be there in a minute. So we went out to the parking lot, me and Skeeter. Skeeter had his egg in that pocket right there on your T-shirt because that's a safe place to keep an egg, right? Somebody's like, I love you. Oh, my baby. And so after like 5 minutes, Handy pulled into the parking lot, which was like 3 minutes longer than it should have taken, and he took my bag of flour, and he pulled the pencil out, and he slapped a piece of gauze on it, and he wrapped it up with duct tape, and he handed it back to me, which is exactly what I would have done. And he said, sorry, it took me so long. I didn't know how bad your baby was bleeding. I stopped at the store, and I bought this, and he pulled out a 5-pound bag of flour in case we had to do a transfusion. And Skeeter said, well, it's a good thing we didn't because Bill's is whole wheat and you bought bleach. That probably would have killed it. And then if you jump ahead just a couple more years, probably just a year, it was 2 in the morning. It was the day before buck season. I was sitting in my living room watching a movie, waiting for the sun to come up so I could go deer hunting, when I heard a knock at the back door. Well, I knew not to answer it, because I knew if anybody was knocking on my back door at 2 in the morning the day before buck season, it had to be Skeeter. But I opened the door anyway, and he didn't say nothing. He just came in my house. He had a diabolical grin on his face. He had a paper bag in his hand. He set the paper bag on the floor and sat down at the kitchen table. I went to brew up a pot of coffee because I could tell it was going to be a long night. I brought the coffee over. I sat down, and finally Skeeter said to me, I've been up all night sewing. Well, I wasn't used to my best buddy sewing. I didn't know what to make of that. But he reached down, he picked up that paper bag, he opened it up, and he pulled out something long and brown and furry. And he sort of flipped it open and pulled it on his head, and by gosh, that kid could sew. What he had made was a perfect replica of an 8-point buck's head. And he said to me from inside that deer mask, "Don't worry, I made one for you too." So there we were, 2 young bucks sipping coffee at the kitchen table. It is a bad joke, but if you'd have thought of it, you'd have put it in your story. But I knew that couldn't be the whole plan, and after a minute, Skeeter said, "That ain't the whole plan." He said, "I also took a mannequin. I dressed him in hunter's orange, and I tied him to the hood of my truck." He said, "What we are going to do is drive around town like it's people season." And we got one. He said it'll be funny. And it was funny, but it's exactly the sort of funny that you don't want your dad to find out that it was you who did it. So we decided to go hide out. We had about 6 hours to kill before dawn. So we went up the old service road at the state park there. We were in Skeeter's truck. Skeeter had just got his truck brand new that summer, only had about 80,000 miles on the odometer. But the odometer was in the glove box and was disconnected from any other mechanical device. And the first time I'd ever gone to roll down the passenger side window, I took about a quarter turn on the crank, and the window just went thunk, and we never saw it again. Which was fine in the summer because the truck didn't have air conditioning. But that night it was about 10 degrees and the wind was just blowing right in that window. There was frost building up on both sides of the windshield. We didn't have enough money to buy enough gasoline to run the engine, to run the heater for 6 hours. I don't know if I've made this clear, but Skeeter and I were pretty dumb. So we weren't dressed properly. I was freezing. Finally, I reached into that paper bag, pulled out one of those masks and put it on. Well, it was warm and cozy inside that mask. Skeeter reached in that bag, pulled out his mask, and put his on. Pretty soon we fell asleep. And when I fell asleep, my head fell right out that open window. And you know how sometimes when you're sleeping, somebody will be doing something around you, and your subconscious will pick up on it and be like, "Get up, open your eyes." But other times, maybe like a snake crawled into your bed, your subconscious will be like, "Now, wake up, but don't move." That's what my subconscious was telling me, so I opened my eyes, and sure enough, about 30 yards down the road, there were 2 bright lights about that far apart, about that high off the ground. The sun had just started to turn the sky gray. I could barely make out the silhouette of a large American sedan, and as the sun came up over the mountaintop, 2 sunbeams came down the mountain, up that dirt road, across the back of that car, over the top of that car, and one of those sunbeams went through a blue light, and one of those sunbeams went through a red light. And the door of that car opened up, and Sheriff Hasbro started to get out. Now, Sheriff Hasbro was a big man. He was about 6'8", 6'9", weighed about 480 pounds. But it wasn't all muscle. So it took him a long time to get out of a Ford Tempo. And his county didn't have much of a budget. As he was working his way out of that car, I was poking Skeeter, trying to wake him up, and pretty soon Sheriff Hasbro was creeping down the road. He had that big flashlight on his shoulder. He was coming in slow. Now, I don't want to call the man a coward, but, you know, you don't just want to run up on a pickup truck with a guy tied to the hood and 2 deer sitting in the cab. And I was laying there thinking the smartest thing to do is to do nothing. But if you were ever a teenager in a small town, and I'm guessing some of you were, you know that the police don't always have enough to do. And so they come looking for you to see what you're doing. And Skeeter and I were conscientious young men, so we endeavored to participate in activities which allowed local law enforcement to practice the skills that they had learned at their academy. I thought, I'm just going to make a little deer noise. So I just sort of went, huh. Now, I'm not saying it was a good deer noise, but it was effective. Sheriff Hasbro, all 6'8", 480 pounds of him, he just left the ground. He jumped so high that Skeeter had time to start the engine, defrost the window, and drive underneath of him before he ever came back down. We just made our way around that sheriff's car and headed on into town. Now we weren't lawyers, we hadn't been to law school, but we had watched a lot of Starsky and Hutch. And he had never said freeze, he hadn't read us our rights. How are we supposed to know we were in trouble? Who knew that it was illegal to impersonate a deer? We just headed on into town. Now, the road into Half Dollar, West Virginia is pretty straight by West Virginia standards, but it is one of these up and down jobs, and after a while, we could see that sheriff's car coming up over the hills behind us. Now, he still wasn't gaining on us. I wanted to find out what was happening, so I switched on the CB and turned it to the police channel, just in time to hear Sheriff Hasbro say, "Tom," Tom was the deputy, he said, "Tom, I don't care if you think I am crazy. There are 2 deer driving Skeeter Bart's pickup truck down the highway. And I believe they got Skeeter tied to the hood." And Tom said, "Well, good." Well, you can see where that might hurt our feelings. I turned off the CB, we headed on into town, but this was 1986. This was small town West Virginia. You know what I'm talking about. There was no internet, there was no CNN. We didn't even get public radio back there. So what people did for their news and information in the morning was turn on their police scanners. So when we came around the corner into Main Street, there were people lined up and down both sides of the street drinking coffee with their curlers in. I thought H.G. Wells was landing spaceships on the courthouse lawn. I turned the CB back on to find out what was going on, just in time to hear Tom say, "Sheriff Hasbro, I called the FBI, just like you said. And the FBI called Animal Control. And Animal Control said you should consider them 2 deer armed and dangerous. They said you're allowed to use lethal force if necessary." Well, that was a little bit more than we had bargained for. So Skeeter just sort of pulled to the side of the road, and Sheriff Hasbro pulled in behind us. And after a minute, he got out of his car and came over, made us take off our masks, and then he yelled at us for a good long time. Gave us each a ticket for the crime of mayhem, dressed as an 8-point buck. We each had to pay a little fine and do a little community service. But I think what we learned from all of this is they say that true forgiveness comes only after you have honestly repented of your sins and after you promise to never take any glory from the original action. So I think I can safely say, with that in mind, that Skeeter and I will never be forgiven for what we did that day. Thank you very much.